Alright, cool. So, today I want to talk about the effects of religion on the nervous system. And I want to talk about the stark contrast in the schemas between Eastern religion and Western Christianity. Before we get into it, I need to do a little bit of scientific introduction. So, two main things we're going to be talking about are attachment and polyvagal theory. So, secure attachment and insecure attachment are a child's level of security and safety in the bonding with their caregivers. How loud is that? I'll just repeat it anyway. Insecure attachment are the infant's relationship to the caregiver or parent, or typically the mother. And a secure attachment is an attachment wherein the child feels safe and loved and protected, whereas the insecurely attached child does not fully embrace that feeling of safety or being protected. And so the reason this is vital to understand is in polyvagal theory, there are two branches to the nervous system. One is a stress response, the other is a rest response. So the parasympathetic is the rest response, and what that does for the body is takes care of a lot of the autonomic functions of just like maintenance. So we're talking immune function, we're talking cellular growth, neurogenesis, healing a wound, even things like digestion, just a lot of the basic, if you're safe, your body can take care of itself. The stress response, which is the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, its goal is to actually shut off all the energy output your body's putting toward those autonomic functions so that you can assess a threat and either deal with it or escape it. So the reason schemas that promote a prolonged or residual sense of stress or a sense of threat is that residual feeling of not being safe is actually impairing the function of the nervous system in how it heals and takes care of the body. If the stress response goes on for too long and the body doesn't get enough time to rest. So if we look at the schemas within Eastern religion, what we see is in Taoism and Buddhism is a sense of belonging to the world, a sense that there's a pervasive order to how nature unfolds, and in our relationship to our reality, we allow emotions to arise and we investigate and we learn from them. So things like suffering or anger or lust, these aren't inherently evil things in Eastern religious ideologies. And another thing that we look at in terms of the practice of the Eastern religions, such as meditating and yoga and like chanting or humming, these things at the time, you know, it was just cultural. Uh, Now that we have the science to measure these things, we do see that these things stimulate the vagus nerve, which engages that rest response, which is good for our bodies and good for healing and growth. So, if everyone were born into an Asian religious culture, and if everyone were born insecurely attached, the ways that you would attempt to cultivate a sense of safety in your community and your environment would be through things like body work, like breath work, or the mindfulness of meditation, or yoga, or even singing, or doing those chants, because those hums, the vibrations that go up the neck stimulate that vagus nerve, which stimulates your body to understand it's in a state of safety for whatever reason. And for that reason, that sense of safety reduces your stress levels, your stress hormones, and your body begins to do its regenerative functions. So even if everyone in a religious Asian culture had an insecure attachment with their caregivers, the most therapeutic things that they could do are actually incorporated within that religion. So if we then go to Western Christianity, we see an extremely different level of therapy and repression. So in Christianity, the entire mythology is based on insecure attachment. There is no balance of masculine and feminine power. In fact, the mother figure of the religion is entirely absent, not even mentioned. And we have a God who emulates an abusive father. You know, whether this God intends to be or not, in the mythology of the religion itself, we have a God who creates beings who are less powerful than he is, and he does this so that they will love him. And if we were to infer that Christianity were actually correct, which I don't believe, but for the sake of conversation, assuming Yahweh is real, and assuming that he created reality for the reasons that are mentioned in the Bible, what we could infer from his life before his creation of this reality is that he wanted there to be a mother that was not there. He had a longing for a mother that was absent from his life. And we can infer that he felt powerless, which is why when he creates a universe, he has to be the most powerful thing. And we can assume, based on his own behavior, that he's modeling his sort of rage outbursts and his abusive hot-cold tendencies toward the human species based on his attachment with an abusive father. So, and you know, the stories all have these themes. You can find them over and over again. So you have Samson, for example, who is a very powerful man, but a woman cuts his hair and makes him powerless. And like Eve is the reason that humanity fell, according to the myth, even though obviously God specifically put the forbidden fruit within reach and tempted them into it. But that's a digression. The the danger of having a dominant religious culture in a society or in a culture is when it's based on insecure attachment, there is a fundamental threat to one's authenticity. So to put it this way, the religion of Christianity is based on earning God's approval so that you can be loved and you can be nurtured in this heavenly afterlife. And your devotion to God and your abstinence from sinful behavior are these things that win you God's approval. And this is another sort of insecure attachment dynamic, because if you were unconditionally loved, you wouldn't have to worry about your behavior. You wouldn't have to earn God's love by doing what he wants you to do. And because of this, if there are certain emotions that are deemed sinful in the religion, and in this one there are, that means those emotions are a threat to your lovability by this sort of ultimate, all-powerful father figure. So there's a benefit to pushing down how you really feel, because if you fully express yourself, you are doing sinful things, and therefore you're losing favor with God or your religious community. So this invokes a stress response. This idea of alienation being a constant threat, which is pervasive in the Christian ideology, is something that will residually activate the stress hormones and really engage that sympathetic stress response. And so it will be more often shutting off those processes like digestion or, healing, or all those things that we talked about, and more that have slipped my mind, because the parasympathetic does a lot for the body. It's got a lot going on. Another stark contrast I want to talk about, the lack of sense of belonging in Christianity versus Asian religions, is that sort of Far East modality has an understanding that the environment sort of is one, that nature and people are on the same plane, that much like a plant can bud a flower, the earth can bud a variety of different life forms, humans being one of them. And so we see in the practices that herbalism and farming and these sort of gardening and these kinds of things are emblematic of a healthy relationship, a healthy attachment to the planet itself. So if you feel you have a healthy attachment to the planet, there's less reason for you to feel there's a need to fight your environment to get your needs met. There's an understanding that the earth produces things that can nourish you, and you can sort of cultivate teamwork with the environment. It's not hierarchical. In the Western religion, Christianity, it is hierarchical, meaning God really owns everything because he's the most powerful, and he decides the fate of everything. And as you go down the line, you have, God's favorite creation, which happens to be humans based on the mythology, which means anything below humans is a less than existence, and therefore it exists for the exploitation of the Christian. So all animals exist to be slaughtered, all land exists to be conquered and claimed, and we see the parasitic relationship with the environment in the Western world, largely, I think, because of the Christian ideology. Because Western civilization feels that nature is inherently a threat. And it feels this way because there's an idea that if we do not dominate and force nature to do what we want it to, there may not be enough for us. And our contribution towards climate change is definitely justified, or at least the groundwork was all justified in, the Bible, which has been extremely culturally relevant for a couple thousand years. But if everyone in the Christian society were born insecure attached, meaning they didn't have a safe relationship with their parents or caregivers, the ideologies within the Christian religion are not therapeutic at all. They are, in fact, encouraging someone to double down on appeasing abuse and codependency rather than doing something therapeutic. So the practices in Christianity are things like prayer and ritual, in terms of trying to change God's mind about his own plan, I guess. Begging the Godhead for mercy or for resources or what have you. It just encourages a sense of powerlessness. There's a lack of autonomy and a lack of agency in Western religion because it is hierarchical, meaning it's asking authority to give what is needed. So it's essentially a baby crying for attention. The only way an infant knows how to get its needs met, since it has no autonomy, no agency, and no capability to get its own food or to find shelter or any of that. An infant is literally dependent on the caregivers for everything. So its only means of actually having influence is to cry out for help. And this is the relationship between Christians and the Christian God, is we are powerless, therefore we need to ask God for intervention and help. And a feeling of powerlessness contributes to the body's stress response, because if something bad happens, you are at the mercy of whatever predator or whatever tragic situation is occurring. Meaning you're always hyper-vigilant to some extent. There's always one potential little thing that can all of a sudden spin your life out of control, and you're just going to have to endure it. Whether or not this might be true in your given situation, the feeling itself disengages your parasympathetic rest response. So just believing you're powerless and reiterating that sense to yourself through the practices of your religion will exacerbate that insecure attachment. All right, so what I was getting at is that the Christian ideology is one inherently based on non-consent because it is hierarchical. Meaning, you don't own your body and can't own your body because God is always more powerful than you and can choose what happens to it. So if you go blind, it was part of God's plan. End up in a car accident and have to get a leg replaced or something. It was God asserting His will on your body, and you cannot resist it. And the feeling of not owning your body is something that is inherently traumatic. And we see this in how the level of tension and stress held within our bodies due to this, such as things like alexithymia or whatever, we see that the belief in not owning your own body is, again, something that activates a stress response because you don't get to choose what happens to your physical well-being. And in Western culture, it's further exacerbated by the fact that it's capitalist. And that means that you also don't have consent, or you don't have a right to your body in a variety of ways. So if you want to experience a psychedelic trip, this is something illegal, and just having the substances that would allow you to experience your mind the way you want to experience it could get you, punished by this authoritative legal system, which is again emblematic of a insecure attachment to an abusive father figure, someone who will punish you for not behaving the way that they want. They want you to behave specifically. And, really, in capitalism, it's endless. The amount of examples on why, if you don't have enough money, you aren't worthy of access to food, so you don't have the right to nourish your body unless you earn it through appeasing a corporate structure, which is, again, hierarchical. We can do this with healthcare in the States because somehow that's not a human right. We don't need to get into the hours it would take to list every reason why capitalism is fundamentally non-consent and no self-ownership. But I also wanted to mention that we look at the Western religion that we've been talking about, Christianity, and really that one's the same as Judaism and Islam. They're all, in terms of insecure attachment, it's the same guy. He's an abusive father, there's an absent mother. But if we look at Middle Eastern, we're seeing there's a balance of feminine and masculine power, which at least there's representation, right? In Christianity, there's really there's no goddess, there's no balance of masculine and feminine power. And so that's why we see these religions being the most misogynistic religions, obviously. And, sucks to be you if you're a female born into such a religion. But I think I had other things that I said earlier that was not recorded when the camera cut off, so this is something I talk about forever, so I'm just going to call it. You have a good one.